Do you know, thinking about this channel over the last few days, I've been looking back at the content and blimey, it's a bit grim some of the time, isn't it? End of the world stories, apocalypse films, monsters, aliens, terrible things happening to the world. Not a lot of happiness and joy. But I thought I'd change that just for a little while. A couple of videos of something from my youth which is a bit more upbeat and a bit more positive, a bit more sunny and a bit more joyous. In this first video, I'm taking you back to 1970 when we meet quite a famous wizard from the 11th century. His name, Catweazle. Hello, welcome back to my world of stuff. My name is This, and you're very welcome to my world of stuff. If you are new here, why not like and subscribe to the channel? Press that subscribe button. It's the sensible, decent thing to do because this channel is full of retro stuff. Films, TV, books, unboxings, bit of Doctor Who now and again. Lovely stuff. Take you back to happier days, days of your youth when life was a bit less complicated and noisy than it is today. So press that subscribe button and stick around. And if you are a subscriber, don't forget to watch the videos, because apparently 69% of people who watch my videos aren't subscribers. So I don't know what you're doing with your time if you're not watching this channel. Let's go back to 1970 and meet a very special TV character. As I mentioned before the credits, I thought I would do something which is a bit more upbeat and a bit less miserable, because I love my post-apocalypses, I love my disaster movies and alien invasions and earthquakes and God knows what. But it is all a bit doom and gloom. And believe it or not, I'm not a completely doom and gloom kind of guy. Back in 1970, a TV series arrived, which only ran for two 13-part series, but is still very fondly remembered, I think, and a sort of beloved TV series that might have slipped your memory. And I thought I would have a little chat about it today because I've been re-watching it over the last few days in preparation for doing a video about it. And it is an absolutely charming series called Catweazle, starring Geoffrey Bayldon as an 11th century wizard who finds himself plunging forward 900 years in time, pitching up in the 20th century where he, quite frankly, hasn't got a clue what's going on. The series was created by a sometime actor called Richard Kip Carpenter. You might see his name popping up in the credits of sort of B-movies and things in the 1960s. And in fact, he played one of the scientists in the film Terranauts, which I reviewed 3 or 4 weeks ago. Catweazle came about when he was on holiday with his wife, visiting some friends in the south of England. And they went for a Sunday morning walk in the countryside and came across a gate to a field with a slightly rusted plaque on it, or name. The name was Catweazle, spelled slightly differently to the TV version. The name stuck in Richard Carpenter's head, and I believe that the idea of Catweazle the character and Catweazle the series arrived pretty much fully formed, and he set to work on writing a script for this new idea that he'd had. At the time, ITV were looking for some new children's programmes. It was suggested that the children's department of ITV was lacking slightly, that they needed some more content for the kids. So Richard Carpenter approached Joy Whitby. She was an executive at London Weekend at the time, and I believe an old friend of Richard Carpenter's. He pitched the idea to her. She loved it, and he set about writing the first series, or what would become the first series. Catweazle was to be this scruffy, bewhiskered magician from the 11th century whose magic was suspect at best. He was to be dressed in ragged clothes, he was to be a little bit smelly, and of course he was to be completely confounded by the wonders and miracles of the 20th century. Who could play such a man? The role actually went to Geoffrey Bayldon, although apparently high on the list of considerations by the production team, which included Quentin Lawrence, who directed the episodes, was Jon Pertwee. Now, Jon Pertwee, of course, at this time had just become unavailable because he'd taken on the role of the third Doctor in Doctor Who. Geoffrey Bayldon came along. Geoffrey was an actor who, a bit like Clive Dunn in Dad's Army, he was always sort of typecast as older men, even though he wasn't at the time that old himself. I think he was in his 40s. And he had been in consideration at one point for the role of Doctor Who. I don't know if this was at the beginning of the series or when William Hartnell left in the 60s. But Geoffrey was an actor who wanted to be stuck on the treadmill of doing one job, because at that time, of course, Doctor Who was on pretty much all year, 40, 45 episodes a year. He didn't want that treadmill, so he turned it down. Catweazle came along and presumably he saw the scripts and found them irresistible, and this was the part he wanted to play, because I think he must have known even at that stage that there was a lot he could do with this role, and my God did he do a lot with it. First episode of Catweazle aired on the 15th of February 1970 in the UK, although interestingly enough it had aired the month before in the Netherlands for some reason. They got it first, damn you, you Dutch. And it told the story of Catweazle, who lived in a cave post-Norman invasion, and he finds himself being chased through a forest by some Norman soldiers. Hiding in his pocket is his wizard familiar Touchwood, who is a toad. He flees through the forest, believes he can fly to escape the Normans, leaps through the air, plunges into a sort of marshy swamp. When he emerges from the swamp, he finds that something very odd has happened. The swamp is now a puddle, a pool, and he emerges to find that everything has changed. He's landed in the vicinity of a farm called Hexwood Farm, which is run by Mr. Bennett, who's played by Charles Bud Tingwell, who has a son, Edward, called Carrot because of his red hair, played by the actor Robin Davis, whose hair had to be dyed red for the part, which he wasn't particularly pleased about. Catweazle hides in a barn. He's completely baffled by the sight of a tractor, electricity, everything is just completely new to him. Carrot discovers him there and forms a bond of sort of strange friendship with him. Catweazle becomes Carrot's little secret, and he sort of takes to looking after him. Catweazle realises what's happened, that he's flown forward in time, and he's telling Carrot constantly throughout the 13 episodes that he's from the past and he wants to get back there. Carrot just thinks that this is a delusional old man, and he doesn't believe any of his fantasies. Catweazle takes up home in a nearby abandoned water tank, which she calls Castle Sabarak, and across the course of the first 13 episodes they get into misadventures and scrapes. There's no jeopardy, there's no danger, there's nothing horrifying or terrifying. This was jaunty Sunday tea time family adventure aimed particularly sort of at the kids. I think it was more of a children's series, but it's very glossy, it's very well made, it's all on film, the production values are very good. It was filmed on location at a place called Home Farm in a village called East Clandon, which is near Dorking. Studio work was done in Halliford Studios near Guildford. Studios that had been around for years, long since decommissioned as studios, closed down in 2014, now redeveloped as waterside flats of accommodation. But they had a history of film and television production going back many years. So the interiors were filmed there, exteriors were filmed out and about on location in the farm. And those first 13 episodes are, it's a word I've used before for things, it's charming. It's one of those shows that you watch it, and I think if you saw it at the time, it will take you back to those days. Even though it was screened in the winter, it's so summery, and it was obviously filmed the summer before. But it has that feeling of wide open spaces in the countryside and romping adventures and secrets and quirky country folk. It is such a warm and embracing series, and it just throws you right back to those days. I mean, I remember watching this back in 1970, and at the time I was watching all these Doctor Who's and Batman and the Jerry Anderson shows. I keep going on about these shows that I watched when I was growing up, but these were all the things that formed my interest in science fiction and imaginative fiction. And Catweazle was something different because it was comedic, it was knockabout, it was very knockabout. But the whole idea of this time traveller sort of drew me in, and the scripts played so well on his lack of understanding of the modern world. A light bulb was the sun in a bottle, powered by electricity. A phone was the telling bone, not the telephone, and all these things that were so cleverly written into the script. But what brought even more to the character and the stories was Geoffrey Bayldon's performance, because he absolutely threw himself into this part with this incredibly physical performance of this wiry, wild-looking character racing about in these ragged clothes, fizzing and hissing. And that's something, again, which he brought to the part. He would do these things, and it's hard to describe them because it's all in the performance. He makes these little noises, little jumping noises, and he hisses at things, and his reactions, to the point that eventually, as he was writing the scripts later on, Richard Carpenter would put in Catweazle fizzes, which would be Geoffrey Bayldon's cue to do his thing. Literally fizzing in front of the camera. It's wonderful stuff. Surely it's no surprise then that this heady concoction of slapstick, witty, inventive scripts, bright, colourful sunshine, wide open spaces, this was catnip for kids back in 1970. As for 13 weeks, they followed the adventures of Carrot and Catweazle as they tried to avoid discovery by Carrot's dad, and Sam, the well-meaning, gentle giant farmhand played by the much-remembered Neil McCarthy. This show was just unmissable, and I'm one of the people who made sure I was there at 5:30 on Sunday afternoons to watch this show. And across the 13 episodes, Carrot and Catweazle had all these wonderful adventures, driven by comedy and slapstick and this fish-out-of-water thing. And the series was full of fantastic guest stars, character actors of the era, people like Hattie Jakes, Peter Sallis, who turned up in an early episode and actually returned as the same character in the second series, Brian Wilde, Aubrey Morris, Peter Butterworth, who would appear in the second series, Patricia Hayes, John Junkin. Names that don't mean much to kids today, obviously. But to my generation, these are people who popped up in things you always went, oh, look, it's so-and-so. Catweazle was a massive hit with huge ratings, and it's not surprising that it was commissioned for a second series. But things were slightly different in the second series. Quentin Lawrence was no longer directing the episodes. Behind the cameras for the second series were David Reed and David Lane. David Lane was well known for having worked on a lot of Gerry Anderson productions in the 1960s, and indeed around this time he would have been working on Gerry Anderson's sublime and seminal UFO series. But the format was the same, but slightly different. Catweazle found himself back in the 20th century again, having been captured by a Norman nobleman, played by Amore Watson, and his dungeon master, played by Peter Butterworth. Remember those names, we'll hear them again in a moment. The Norman noble wanted Catweazle to transform base lead into gold. Catweazle eventually managed to escape from the castle by hurling himself off the parapets in the mistaken belief he could fly. Of course he doesn't, he lands in the moat. When he emerges from the moat, he's back in the 20th century in the grounds of a huge manor estate out in the countryside. This is Brickenbury Estate in Hertfordshire, which was used for the location filming. Here, the dynamic is much the same. He meets up with a young lad called Cedric, played by Gary Warren, who is best remembered from his role in the original Railway Children film. And they become friends. Cedric is home for the summer holidays. He tries to hide Catweazle from his family, and eventually Catweazle finds a new home in an abandoned railway station called Duck Halt. The dynamic is different here because, as I said, we're in this country estate, and this is run by the Dottie Collingwood family, played by Elspeth Gray and Moray Watson. Their groundsman is played by Peter Butterworth, and I think the suggestion, although I don't think it's referenced much in the scripts as far as I can recall, that they are the descendants of the 11th century tormentors who forced Catweazle to find his way back to the 20th century. But things are different here because these characters are much more upper class, although they're slightly dotty and perhaps slightly failing upper class. They've got this estate, but they seem to be struggling to keep it going. I suppose that mirrors the farm element of the first series, but it feels different. Cedric is slightly less likeable than Carrot because he seems like a different strata to many of the people who would have been watching the show. I think you noticed that particularly in the first episode where Cedric has come home for the summer holidays and his parents are saying to him, well, you haven't written much this year? And he says, well, I've written half an opera. Of course, they're referring to him writing to them from school. So it's a different sort of level. And I can understand why Richard Carpenter wanted to do that, because he'd explored that working class dynamic of Catweazle meeting people working on the land, and he wanted to explore the differences between Catweazle and privileged people in the 20th century. I don't know that it works all that well because the privileged people are a bit silly. The Collingwood family are a bit daft. And the fact the whole of the second series is more slapstick and slightly less subtle than the first, but it's still a joy to watch. It still has that feeling of the summer, and both series just remind you of those endless summers that we had as kids when the days seemed to go on forever and the school holidays went on forever and you'd go out on adventures. It's so nostalgic in that regard. And even the second series, which I don't think is quite as good as the first, possibly because the novelty has worn off a little bit. We've seen Catweazle in the past coming into the modern day. It's going through the motions again, but there's always new stuff. There's always new elements that Richard Carpenter finds to exploit. I think the whole thing about Catweazle, perhaps, that would scupper its chances if it was to be pitched today, is unfortunately reflective of the world that we live in. The idea of a 10, 12-year-old boy befriending a scruffy, potentially insane old man dressed in rags might be a bit problematic, might be a few red flags there, which is a shame. And I think that's another example of how the world has changed, not for the better, since those innocent, heady days of the 1970s when Not every old man was a paedophile, frankly. Across the second series, there's a sort of arc running through the season because Catweazle believes that if he can collect these certain relics, which are all signs of the zodiac, that they will combine, give him the power to fly, which is his obsession throughout the series. Every episode finds him trying to get hold of one of these symbols, and eventually, of course, he does. I think one of the most charming things about Catweazle is that he's this incompetent magician. Or is he? Because even though he's got one of his catchphrases, nothing works when he gets frustrated when one of his magic spells doesn't work. We do see him throughout the series doing magical things, performing magical feats. In the first series, he casts a spell that stops Carrot talking about him to his father. He can't speak when he comes to try and talk about Catweazle. And in an episode of the second series, he manages to cure somebody of hay fever. So he can do these little feats of magic, but he can't quite achieve the big stuff that he wants to do. He wants to be able to fly. He wants to be able to do big things, but he can do little things. So there is a suggestion that he does have some, not exactly supernatural powers, but he does have some magic abilities, which he uses to his advantage throughout both series. And of course, we remember some of his catchphrases, his magical incantations, Salme, Dalme, Adonai. You know, I knew all these off by heart at the time, but they've sort of faded into the mist of time. Like the first series, the second series featured guest performances from a number of well-known character actors of the time. Bill Owen, Ronald Lacey, Kenneth Cope from Randall and Hopkirk Deceased, Graham Crowden, Dudley Foster and Tony Selby. They all popped up in little guest roles throughout the second season. By the end of the second series, Catweazle had gathered together all his bits and pieces, all his relics, all his zodiac symbols through a number of increasingly silly and slapstick stories, it must be said. And he achieves his ambition and his aim to fly in a balloon. And he gets aboard a hot air balloon and he drifts into the distance. He doesn't travel back to the past, he remains in the 20th century. It's another quite poignant ending because Cedric sort of waves him goodbye, and a bit like Carrot, you know, am I going to see you again? Are we going to see Catweazle again? It's a lovely poignant ending to the series, of course, that wasn't necessarily intended to be the ending. It was still hugely popular, was putting in huge viewing figures Sunday evenings during the winter, and there were plans for a third season. Now, Geoffrey Bayldon apparently wasn't too sure. He felt that the idea had sort of been done to death across 2 seasons, and there may be some truth in that. You do wonder what further adventures he could have had. But there were plans for a third series. And the third series would have apparently taken Catweazle back to Hexwood Farm, which he would have found as deserted. And I think possibly the mystery would have been Catweazle trying to find out what had happened to the Bennett family and hopefully being reunited with Carrot. Some scripts were written, I believe, pre-production was done, there were plans in place. But many years ago, and I hate to name drop, but I know I do it occasionally, I spoke to Richard Carpenter because Robin of Sherwood, one of the many shows he went on to create, I think it was in its third series at the time, and I interviewed him and we talked about Catweazle, of course, and he mentioned that, I remember him describing it as a palace revolution at LWT. Different turnover of different commissioners, different behind the scenes bods who didn't want a third series of Catweazle, so the series never happened. Richard Carpenter, as I say, he went on to create lots of other shows. He created shows like The Ghosts of Motley Hall, Robin of Sherwood, Dick Turpin. He even wrote a very well-remembered, pretty scary show called The Boy from Space, which I think was part of BBC children's programmes in the 70s. I'll just say The Boy from Space and see if any of you remember it. And I might actually do a video about it because I did see it a few years ago and it is well weird. And he wrote that using very simplistic language because it was a schools program, so there was no flowery dialogue. It was all very simplistic, short words. But it's quite an eerie program if you've ever seen it, and I suspect that some of you out there have. So that was Catweazle. He disappeared into the ether, never to be seen again. His time cut short by TV executives who thought they knew better. Richard Carpenter always harboured thoughts of bringing the character back, and in fact, I understand that a film script was written, which was going to go into production. I think that it was written and ready to go, and there was some pre-production in place. I don't know who was going to play Catweazle. I don't know who ever went as far as casting. But unfortunately, Richard Carpenter died before it could go before the cameras, and project died with him. Catweazle had an afterlife, as many of these things did back in those days. There were comic strips in TV Comic, and then it moved over to a more sophisticated strip that ran in Look-In, the Junior TV Times, and in fact, The strip was so popular, it ran until 1974, so it ran for 3 years after the series itself was cancelled. There were 3 annuals from World Distributors based on the series, and there were 2 paperback books. There was one that novelised the first series. This is the edition of it that I had. Now, I had both of these books. This is a reprint edition from, I think, as late as 1987, because these books have been in print for years, and I think they've only fairly recently gone out of print. This is a re-release from nearly 2 decades later. There was a second book, Catweazle and the Magic Circle, which novelised the second season. Even that's not the end of Catweazle, though. Now, this is a piece of information I discovered just a few weeks ago, and in fact, it's one of the things that spurred me on to making a video about the show. In 2021, there was a Catweazle film. That film did happen. Now, it's nothing to do with Richard Carpenter's script, as far as I know. It's never been released in the UK. I know absolutely nothing about it other than the trailer, which I will put a link for, a YouTube link for, in the description below. This was a German film starring a very popular German comedy actor called Otto Walkes. I'm sure he does. I looked at the trailer. If you look at the trailer, it's uncanny. His resemblance to Geoffrey Bayldon, the costume, the whiskers, his antics are all very, very Catweazle. But he was actually in his 70s, I think, when he made the film. Hard to believe that he was throwing himself around and he's an elderly gentleman. And I've never seen this film. I didn't know it existed till a few weeks ago. I can only assume that there are licensing, copyright reasons why it's never been dubbed or given subtitles and released in the UK, because I would really like to see this film because it looks like a lot of fun. It seems more plot heavy. There seem to be villains in it, which isn't quite what Catweazle was about. I don't think you get away with the sort of lightweight stories that the original series told, because it's a different time. You have to have a bit more going on. So Catweazle has left his mark in history across 2 series, a few bits of ephemeral merchandise, and this film, which I would love to see. If anybody out there knows any more about this film, please let me know in the comment section down below, because I would just like to know the history of it, how it came about, what happened to it when it was released in Germany. Was it a hit? Did it flop? Was anybody aware of it? It just seems to have sailed completely under everybody's radar, and I'd love to know more. And I must also mention, of course, which I should have done earlier, the fantastic theme tune, which speaks to me of Sunday tea times in the 1970s. The glorious Busy Boy, which was composed by Ted Dix. I'll also put a link in the description down below to the YouTube link where you can actually hear the track unencumbered by all the pops and bangy sound effects that they put on the title sequence. That's Catweazle, which I have such fond memories of, and I feel so warm when I think about it, because it, like I say, it reminds me of those childhood Sunday afternoons, 5:30 appointment of you television to watch Catweazle. The show is still available. It was released on network. I think it was released on 2 separate box sets of both seasons, then a box set. There was then a later 20th anniversary, 25th anniversary box set. You may well find those on the secondary market now. Obviously, network's no longer with us. You should be able to pick them up somewhere. All episodes are on YouTube. Of course, the quality is what you might expect. They're also on ITVX. If you subscribe to their premium ad-free service, you will find Catweazle there. The quality of the prints is pretty dire. I mean, they're quite clear, they're quite watchable, but they're full of crackles and hisses and pops and things. This is a show made on film that will be perfect for a Blu-ray release. Now, whether that will ever happen, I don't know. On the face of it, it seems like a show that would have limited commercial appeal. But Wurzel Gummidge was recently released on Blu-ray. The master tapes of those were found and buffed up for Blu-ray. I don't see why the same can't be done for Catweazle. It would be really nice to have beautiful, pristine copy of Catweazle, because it is so colourful. Those vivid, summery colours, the bright sunshine, the bright skies that we never have anymore. Beautiful landscapes. It would be beautiful to see it on Blu-ray. So fingers crossed that the gods of physical media will make it happen. So that's Catweazle. I hope you enjoyed my own little Catweazle time travel. I've gone back in time, whereas he went forward in time. I've gone back to early 1972. Remind myself of one of those shows that, because it's not action and adventure and full of special effects, because there are no real special effects in this at all, it's sort of faded, I suppose, from people's memories, and I hope that I've done something to bring it back into your memories, and I hope that you will track it down and enjoy it just as much as I've enjoyed watching it over the past week and a half or so. That's Catweazle. Right, thank you for watching. As I said at the beginning, don't forget to like and subscribe. Press that button. Go on, do it. Let me know what your memories are of Catweazle. And leave a comment down below. As ever, it's always great to hear from you guys. So I would love to hear what you remember about watching Catweazle. If you remember those Sunday afternoons, 5:30, Catweazle. Great stuff. They don't make them like that anymore. Right, thank you for watching. I will see you soon. But until I do, you keep taking the stuff.